Welcome, everyone. I'm George Friday. Caitlin Saposi-Belknap is on the webinar with me, and thanks for joining us for Why the World Needs Move to Amend. I'm one of the founders, as is Caitlin, and I'm on the executive team or board of Move to Amend. We're glad to have you here, and we're going to jump right in. First, let me tell you a little bit about what you can expect on the call. Hopefully everyone can hear us, and if you're having trouble hearing, I plug in here because somehow my technology doesn't work, and on occasion I've had to call in. So there's a number here that you can call in, and then you use the attendee access code. Sometimes they'll say meeting ID, and hit pound, and then you'll be able to hear us if you're having problems with that. There are also questions that you can get at the bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A function. I see that someone's added a question, and we'll deal with those. And then, of course, if you've got any technical difficulties, you can email Zoom at that email address at the bottom here, info@zoom.us. Now, let's think a little bit and talk a little bit about Move to Amend. Our mission is to bring together and build the coalition of hundreds of organizations, hundreds of thousands of individuals that are committed to social and economic justice through ending corporate rule and building a vibrant democracy that's accountable to the people, not to corporate interests. That's our basic mission. Our goals to accomplish that mission is to pass the We the People Amendment, the 28th Amendment, that makes it clear that artificial entities do not have constitutional rights, and money is not speech. We also feel it's important that we are building, supporting, and provoking a discussion and participating in organizing about how to make real the promise of American democracy through constitutional renewal, or for some of us, the existence of it in the first place. We have a basic set of principles and values that are fundamental to our work. They include anti-oppression and solidarity organizing so that we have the power to win. Coalition and movement building, also the same root goal driving that. We do grassroots organizing. It's very important to us to do that. A dedication to political education so that we're building at every step on what happened the step before, and that we maintain political and economic independence. These are important principles and values for us. Our baseline strategy in getting this 28th Amendment and renewing a real democracy in this country is to focus on the people in this country, not focusing on Congress, so that we build a movement for power, enough power so that we can demand the change we need and realize that. We need to be doing coalition building as part of our strategy so that we're reaching out to other organizations and working with folks who are affected by corporate rule and corporate power. We mean to build a broad and diverse, multiracial, intergenerational movement so that we really are consistently reaching out to those who are most affected by corporate rule. And we're talking about not just activism, not just clicking a like or sending a thumbs up, but doing community organizing, basic community organizing. We're focused on grassroots organizing. We want to pass local and state resolutions that call for the amendment, and we're building from the ground up. So Caitlin, I'm kicking it to you.
Thanks, George. So hey, everybody. Like George said at the beginning, I'm Move to Amend's National Director. I'm here in Sacramento, California. And we wanted to explore how Move to Amend potentially affects some of these biggest issues and what would happen if we didn't have Move to Amend. So we have actually some questions for you right now. What do you think is the biggest issue facing humanity? So we put out some examples of what the answer to that question could be. And I'm going to put this up on the screen here so that you can answer. And if you want to suggest a different one than the list that we have here, then you can type your other in the chat as well, and we'll read it out. But just go ahead and click on the screen what you feel, what your answer is. Climate change, species collapse, hunger, war, or something else. What do you think of the biggest issue facing humanity? And again, if you click other, then feel free to say what that other is in the chat so that I can read it out. And we'll give you a couple more minutes. There's only 2 people who have responded so far, so go ahead. And it's a big question, but what do you think? So, and we'll share the results, not of who said what, but what the answers were. Maybe 15 more seconds for you to decide. All right, so William, that's going to come next because this is humanity. So this is the whole globe, and then we're going to talk about in the United States as well, which some of the answers that you have on there will come. We'll say those. So William said climate, income inequality, and universal health care. And let me end the poll. If you missed it, then that's okay. One person said climate change, one person said war, and a couple of you said other. All right. So the next question here is, what do you think is the biggest issue facing Americans? And we put lack of accessible and affordable healthcare, pollution, massive incarceration, police militarization and violence, surveillance of citizens, wars for foreign oil, or other. And we'll let you vote on this one as well. And again, just pick the one that you think is the best answer for the biggest issue facing Americans. And obviously all of these are actually important and critical, right? And it might somewhat depend on where you are and who you are, which of these, how you answer this, right? In terms of what your community and what you're dealing with. Give it maybe another 30 seconds for you to think about it. And give us your answer. All right, so last call. Okay, so I'll end it and share the results. So a couple of folks said lack of healthcare. One person said police militarization and violence, and somebody else said other, but I'm not sure what the other answer was for them. But that's okay. The point of all this is, why haven't we solved these issues? Because actually on most of them, if not all of them, the solutions already exist, right? We don't actually need to come up with the solutions. That is already known what the solution would be. Universal healthcare or single payer or Medicare for all could solve the healthcare issue. We could address climate change by rapidly de-escalating in terms of our fossil fuel use as a species, but certainly as a country, right? So our big question, though, is, did these problems begin with Citizens United? And how well was our government working for us in 2009 before Citizens United? So all of these issues that we've named, all of them were already either in play, well established and problematic, or the beginnings of them were already underway, and Citizens United potentially exacerbated some of it in terms of money and politics and kind of corporate rule of our government and our politicians, but didn't actually create any of these problems. So we want to talk to you about why the solution has to be more than overturning Citizens United, and why Move to Amend is committed to this amendment including more, and why, as the only organization working for an amendment that would actually do more than overturn Citizens United, it's absolutely critical that Move to Amend be strong and successful. So if we're going to talk about amending the Constitution, let's just really quick remind ourselves how to do that, right? Per the Constitution, there are two ways that the Constitution can be amended. One is for 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, to pass an amendment resolution. And then 3/4 of state legislatures have to ratify that amendment, right? The other way, which hasn't been done, but is written as an option in the Constitution, is the Constitutional Convention, where 2/3 of state legislatures call for a convention to propose an amendment, and then still 3/4 of state legislatures have to ratify any amendment that would come out of a convention of the states. So also, if we're going to talk about amending the Constitution, let's make sure we understand it, right? So I'm going to give you just like a quick and dirty constitutional framework, and then I'm going to talk about what it does to the Constitution when corporations have constitutional rights. So first of all, there's two entities in the Constitution, and the Constitution really is just spelling out kind of the relationship and the framework between those two entities. They are we the people and government. And the idea is that we the people are free and sovereign with individual rights, and we're seen as private. And then on the flip side is government. Government, to the extent that government has any power, it's delegated power by the people and is subordinate and accountable to the people with collective duties and public. So that's the idea. It's important that we take a critical moment here to pause and point out that when this Constitution was drafted and subsequently, only 5 to 7% of the population was thought to be people by the people who wrote the Constitution. Certainly all of us have always been people all along, right? But wealthy, white, propertied men, oftentimes Christian, in terms of the particulars in each state, were the only ones who were able to assert their legal personhood. And Howard Zinn, the late Howard Zinn, who is an incredibly important historian and also was one of Move to Amend's original supporters and signers before he passed away, pointed out that the history of the United States can be seen as the story of all the rest of us having to drive ourselves into this document, into the Constitution. And pretty much all of the social movements that we have had have in one way or another been about rectifying this original founding violence and decision on the part of the founders of this country that the rest of us would be left out, and we had to rectify that terrible choice, right? And so if we're going to be talking about the personhood of corporations, we need to recognize that personhood is actually the fundamental problem. That is the US problem, is that we have always answered the question of who is a person wrong. And when we're given the opportunity, most of the time we go wrong until it is corrected by those very people that we have excluded, right? And so that's important for us to understand in terms of this history and this framework and how we got into this situation, because that is not separate from where we are now. That is actually the product of making human beings slaves and basically literally property, or genocide and murder on the part of the native people who lived here. It is no accident that we end up in a situation now where property, which is what a corporation is, has more rights than human beings, because we were backwards from the very beginning, right? And a lot of the unraveling that we need to do needs to start with that fundamental piece. But properly understood, corporations well, first of all, corporations are not in the Constitution at all. That's worth noting, right? And it's not because of the fact that they didn't exist yet. It's not like the reason why airplanes are not in the Constitution, right? It's not that they hadn't been invented. There were corporations, and they were used for a specific purpose of pooling private capital to meet some public need. And so these early corporations had a limited lifespan. They were not allowed to own other corporations. They couldn't make civic contributions. It was a felony in Wisconsin, for example, and most other states for corporations to contribute money to campaigns until the 1950s. This was the law. There were limits on limited liability for corporations. Corporations couldn't own property outside the specific needs of their particular chartered purpose. They didn't have interlocking boards of directors. That was against the law. and they had to live, the people who ran the corporation had to live in the state and sometimes even the county where the corporation was doing business. So there were all these structural pieces of the law that were put in place to make sure that corporations didn't get out of bounds. And the idea is a corporation is a good tool for amassing capital, and it can be useful, but with that comes power. And so you have to kind of keep it in that Pandora's box and be careful about it. And the number one thing that corporations had to prove in order to come into existence in the first place, when they would petition to create a charter, they had to prove that they were going to serve the public good. Can you imagine if we had that as a threshold for a corporation to exist today? That it had to serve, at the beginning, it had to prove that it was going to serve the public good, and that was an ongoing test that was asked of the entity. Are you still serving the public good? And if not, then you don't get to exist and be a corporation and have all of the powers and privileges that come with that form of doing business. So properly understood, corporations are over here on this government side of the line because they are creatures of government. They don't exist just because. They exist because government brings them into existence through the corporate charter, and that's still the case today, right? But after the Civil War, when we had an immense moment of political corruption in this country, second maybe only to the current situation that we're in now, which was really started with the Bush administration and has continued on to today, just getting worse and worse. But this is the robber baron era after the Civil War. And we also had a situation where a lot more people were able to drive themselves into the Constitution, right? By ending slavery, you had African Americans' personhood recognized with the 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th Amendment that was set up to the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to guarantee that there wasn't going to be Jim Crow segregation and that all the states would treat all of the residents equally, regardless of what skin color they had. And then the 15th Amendment saying that the right to vote would not be abridged based on the color of your skin, right? And so you had a whole wave of people driving themselves into the Constitution, and women were right behind that, as the suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement were very linked. And so the ruling elite that had a hold on the power in this country through defining everyone else as non-persons, without personhood status, suddenly their hold on that becomes shaky, and also the Industrial Revolution coming to the United States and the corporation being a very natural tool for capitalism. And those who were, had won the Civil War in the North, and their factories and their banks and all of that, corporations were a nice tool that they wanted to use. And so through all of that, kind of in that key moment, you have corporations able to make the case that they have constitutional rights. And so they tried for a long time, but ultimately in 1886, they were in May 10th, 1886, they were able to not even really win a case. They were able to get the Supreme Court to probably maybe make a weird statement in the head notes of the case saying that all of the justices, who incidentally were all ex-railroad officials themselves, believed that a corporation was a person for the purposes of the 14th Amendment. Again, this is the 14th Amendment meant to guarantee equal protection of the law for Black men, not women, because women didn't have personhood yet. Also, the Supreme Court was who ruled on that. And so as a result of that initial case here, justices have struck down hundreds of local, state, and federal laws that were enacted to protect people from corporate harm. And so it started with the 14th Amendment and co-optation and usurpation of the 14th Amendment. But they didn't stop there. They went on to get Fourth Amendment protections, kind of building on that initial concept of personhood through the 14th Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment guarantees protection against search and seizure. So the whole idea that the books would be open and available for the government and the public to understand what a corporation was doing, that had been the law up until this 1906 case. And Justice Harlan, who was one of the dissenters, said the power of the government by its representatives to look into the books, records, and papers of a corporation of its own creation to ascertain whether that corporation has obeyed or is defying the law will be greatly curtailed, if not destroyed. Think about how many times we have no idea what corporations are doing. We have no idea what chemicals they are releasing into the air. We have no idea what their practices are, how they're building their cars. And And if they didn't have Fourth Amendment protections, we could have access to all of that information. Dodge v. Ford Motor Company is a case from the Michigan Supreme Court in 1919 that did away with this idea that the purpose of a corporation is to serve the public good, and instead replaced it with the purpose of a corporation is to maximize profit for shareholders. And so again, this isn't a US Supreme Court decision, but this is, if you go to law school, you learn that the purpose of a corporation is to maximize profit for shareholders. And the point of us putting this in here is that this is not always what the definition of a corporation was. That has changed over time. This is a human construct, and we can change it if we decide that it isn't working for us. Nothing inevitable about this. Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahon in 1922. This is when corporations got Fifth Amendment takings clause. So the takings clause says that private property will not be taken for public use without just compensation. In this case, the coal industry was digging under people's homes in Pennsylvania and other states and to gather coal, because they had mineral rights, which were different than the land property rights. And entire communities, villages, and towns were sinking into the ground because there was nothing underneath their homes, because the coal industry had dug out all of the coal. So Pennsylvania passed a law to try and protect its people that said you couldn't do that. And the coal industry sued Pennsylvania and made the argument, okay, you can pass that law, but you have to pay us for all the profits that we would have made had you not passed that law. And the Supreme Court agreed and said that a regulation is a taking. And so now when you are involved in local government, I used to be a local elected official in the community I lived before moving to Sacramento. And you know, when you go to think about how to protect your community against environmental harm, especially, with an industry that's, you know, operating in your community, you are told by your attorneys as the city, be careful, you know, what you pass, be careful how you go about this, because you may be on the hook for future profits lost if you regulate too strongly what the corporations can do. And so, you know, what town can actually afford this? So communities that should be passing laws banning fracking because it's detriment to their water supply, our hands are tied because they're worried that they'll be sued for the profits lost. And, you know, it's not just with fracking. That's just one example of industry that pollutes, and then a community can't do anything about it. In Lois K. Leggett versus Lee in 1933, Supreme Court rules again that the 14th Amendment applies to corporations. In this case, a local community in Florida was trying to protect its local economy by passing a law that taxed chain stores higher, because they understood that when the money stays local, it actually is better for the community. And so they were trying to support their local business through economic democracy and a law. And that community was sued, and the court said that that was a violation of the 14th Amendment, discriminating against one kind of business and another. That logic is ridiculous. And also the interstate commerce clause. So that's why a community that, even though it understands well that Walmart is going to cause harm by coming in, has to work only within, you know, the size of a big box store and the, you know, square footage of the building, and can't just say this is bad for our community in a number of ways and we don't want this kind of business here. Buckley v. Vallejo is a case that applies to the kind of second part of our amendment, the money is speech. So this was the case where the Supreme Court ruled that money is speech, that spending money and contributing to candidates and parties is protected by the First Amendment. And we've had this obviously for a long time, since before Citizens United. This is the foundation of the case. This case is the foundation that Citizens United came from. And in this logic, it means that the people with more money are able to exercise their First Amendment rights more. So instead of it being an equalizing force that everybody has free speech and everybody has a right to be heard, it becomes a question of, well, how much money do you have to back up your speech, right? Again, this is not how it was before the mid-1970s. And then this case that came right after, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti. I live in a state that has ballot initiatives, a very powerful way for citizenry to propose laws directly, fought for by the populace. So a number of states have the ballot initiative process. It used to be in Massachusetts and most other initiative states that it was against the law for corporations to contribute money to ballot initiatives and try to influence the law that way. Well, this case, the Supreme Court overruled that law and said that Massachusetts doesn't have an authority to ban corporations from contributing money to the initiative process, and so opened up the floodgates in the initiative process. And I don't know if any of you live in California, but here, you know, this is the case in almost every initiative state. When you look at what's on the ballot, most of the time, it's financed by big money. And if the public is trying to put anything forward, they have to go up against big money. So for example, you know, we had an initiative a few years ago to try and rein in the cost of pharmaceutical drugs, and would have been good for almost everyone. And the pharmaceutical industry poured in millions of dollars, paid, you know, actors to look like doctors on TV and say that this was going to be bad for veterans, etc., and then convinced people that it wasn't in their best interest. So if money wasn't speech and corporations were not people, we actually prohibit corporations from contributing to the political process in that way. Couple more: International Dairy Foods Association versus Amistoy. Again, another First Amendment case. The Supreme Court overrules a law requiring the labeling of bovine growth hormone that Vermont had passed, trying to make sure that people knew what was in their milk. And the courts sided with the dairy industry when they said that that violates their First Amendment right not to speak. The First Amendment makes it, you know, is understood to mean that we don't have to speak, and you can't make a label go on a product against their will, because that violates their First Amendment right not to speak. And so that logic has been applied when trying to label for genetically modified organisms. And the reality is that any of our labeling is potentially vulnerable if a company or an industry wants to make the case that it violates their First Amendment right not to speak. Monsanto's Roundup in California, we have a law that says that you have to label if your product is known to cause cancer. And Monsanto just recently sued and got an injunction against California because of their Roundup herbicide that is known to cause cancer, and made the case that California's law should not stand and is a violation of their First Amendment rights. And then we come to Citizens United, which was the case that officially launched Move to Amend, although we've been working on this issue of corporate constitutional rights since well before Move to Amend was formed in other formations. That overturned McCain-Feingold and basically caused 24 states to have to throw out their campaign finance legislation that they had put in place that was even stronger to help protect the political process, so that people with more money and corporations were not allowed to dominate. And all of that went out the window with Citizens United. And we have seen, you know, a tremendous amount of money poured in, dark money that no one even knows where it comes from. It might even come from foreign governments. All of that was expanded by Citizens United, but not started with Citizens United. And they reiterated the idea that corporations have constitutional rights in that case. McCutcheon versus FEC is again going to the First Amendment money is speech piece. There used to be aggregate limits on the amount that any one individual could donate to federal races in one election. And McCutcheon versus FEC, that got thrown out under the premise that that violates the First Amendment rights of those donors to contribute unlimited amounts to federal campaigns. And then Burwell versus Hobby Lobby stores. This is another case that if we address the money in politics piece, we would still have this. Hobby Lobby is owned by religious fundamentalists who don't believe in birth control or reproductive health for women. And they sued because of the Affordable Care Act and said that they should not have to follow it because it violated their corporation's religious beliefs, not the individuals, but the corporation's religious beliefs. And the Supreme Court agreed. So for the first time, finding that a corporation has religious freedom under the First Amendment. And originally that was only applied for closely held corporations like Hobby Lobby by the Supreme Court, but the Trump administration has expanded that to include all corporations. So the idea that, you know, I mean, there's nothing more personal than your faith, right? But the idea with this is that your personal faith is then imbued into your corporation, even though that corporation, you have limited liability, so it's separate from you. That's the whole point of why you're incorporated. But we're somehow going to imbue the most personal, choices and decisions and worldview into that corporation. Never mind all the rest of the people who are involved with that corporation, the employees and what their faith might be. That doesn't matter. It's only the owners. And so that's ludicrous. And if we overturn Citizens United and pass an amendment establishing again that Congress has the authority to regulate campaign spending, that would do nothing about this Hobby Lobby case. And who knows how this will be used to discriminate against people based on religion in the future. So when corporations move over to this we the people side of the line, it basically perverts the whole idea of the system. And over time, we the people have worked to be recognized, to have our personhood, to have our rights, and that's still an ongoing struggle for many, right? And meanwhile, while we have been building these movements to amend the Constitution further, to make more clear who should be included, and that women should not be excluded, and that Black people should not be excluded, and that 18-year-olds should not be excluded, corporations, meanwhile, through the back door, through the Supreme Court, have been able to get their own personhood, which trumps ours because we can't compete with the resources that they have. We can't live forever like a corporation. We can't be in more than one place at one time. We have to have clean air and clean water to exist. We have people that we have, commitments to and connection to, and can't just do whatever we want. But a corporation doesn't have any of those things. And so they're able to assert their personhood more than the rest of us through their money and other resources. And so it basically turns the Constitution on its head, which was never really the best document in the first place. But what we have is now used against us whenever we try to protect our communities against corporate harm. And this isn't all corporations, but this is those with the most money, the giants that are able to basically throw up the Constitution against the public to say, you shall not pass, you shall not protect yourselves in this way or that way or this way, because that's unconstitutional. So we use the term, or we use the phrase, legalized democracy, because really, with corporate constitutional rights, it makes democracy illegal.
This is a good place to pause for a minute.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, that letting that sink in is beyond what I can imagine, because those cases, just hearing those cases is beyond sobering as well. And I can still remember learning about Buckley versus Vallejo when I was still in college, when the decision was still pretty fresh. But I want to invite you, beyond just getting infuriated by the reality of, in piecemeal, us losing what could have been a really great democracy, free and sovereign, individual rights, privacy, protected, lovely concept. But I want to invite you for a bit to think about where we would be if we had realized the aspirations of what some people think of as the Constitution. There are some folks that think of the founding fathers with this reverence, and like the clouds open and you hear the angels singing whenever the word the founders is mentioned. I haven't ever been one of those people, but I am profoundly enamored of the aspirations of the Constitution. When I lived in DC, I liked going to the Lincoln Memorial on a regular basis. This was one of my pilgrimages. And back then, because it was pre-9/11, I could go all the way up the steps and hang out with Lincoln, often in the wee hours of the night, and have these profound feelings about our country and what we could do. Because even back then, it felt to me like we could realize the best of all of us. And when we have the best of all of us, we truly have democracy. We deserve that. And I think we can realize it together. So I invite you to think about that and imagine that we can get there, and that your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren, if you're lucky enough to have procreated on this planet, or the people that you most care about 7 generations from now could realize that, and it's a beautiful thought. Conversely, and briefly, come back to reality in 2018 and think about the world that we're in. Maybe the vision that comes to you is the lava running around on the island in Hawaii, or the threat of nuclear proliferation beginning in Iran, Israel, North Korea, many possibilities there. And of course, all of the issues that you talked about before. I have a very good friend who I love dearly, who a few years ago, he and another friend started something called hashtag 15 years, because he swears we have that or less to be on the planet. Not something I believe I agree with him on, but I understand what takes him there. And I know when I look around the planet now that the root cause of much that we're dealing with is absolutely US-driven corporate greed. And that greed is manifested by all of the ways. I mean, if we really live in a world where profit is the most important thing, and that's the priority for corporations, and the Supreme Court said so, it's like crazy world. Or if you're a comic book person, upside down world or something that happened in Superman's world. So I want you to think about both of those possibilities, manifesting the aspirations of the best of the Constitution, the best of our country, the best of each of us collectively as we the people, or dealing with the consequences of rampant, ongoing, exploitive greed that is destroying us from the core outward and the whole planet with us. That, to me, is all the motivation needed to make sure we get a 28th Amendment, even if the objective reality of my world day to day doesn't necessarily support that. So how do we get that We the People Amendment, Caitlin?
So we just got a couple more slides, and then we want to turn to your questions and comments. So thanks, George. So the We the People Amendment is the solution to not everything, but really the foundational solution to begin so much. And without it, we're left fighting one fight at a time instead of changing the rules of the system in a structural way, right? And so it makes clear that artificial entities don't have constitutional rights. So any entity created by government, corporations, unions, nonprofits, anything else that we might come up with in the future. It makes clear that spending money on elections is not protected by the First Amendment. And it requires campaign spending to be publicly disclosed. So we have 54 House co-sponsors, 56 on paper, although one person passed away this term and another person stepped down. And so 54 people, 56 offices, led by Richard Nolan, who's from Minnesota. We have passed over 800 city and town resolutions, including hundreds of citizens initiatives where voters directly called for the amendment. 19 states have called for an amendment, including 4 by ballot initiative. Hundreds of thousands of citizen volunteers, and thousands of organizations, labor unions, and faith congregations are part of this movement. We adopted a strategic plan in 2016. We're the only amendment group that has a strategic plan. The purpose was to be transparent and clear with our agenda. It's a 10-year plan to get the amendment passed through either Congress or get to a convention moment, and then ratification would come after. Looking at, what George just said, for example, 15 years left. Okay, well, I don't know if that's true either, but it's time is ticking. No question. So 10 years might feel like too long. But when you look at how far away we are from a functional, real democracy in any way, shape, or form, and this is before Trump was president, we've got a long way to go, right? And so we don't think it serves anybody for us to sort of misrepresent the circumstances as they actually are. We think that part of how we solve this problem is to be real about how big of a problem it really is. And so we do have the steps laid out though, and if we can go faster than 10 years, then great. We just need to do them faster. On some of our goals, we are actually moving faster. Our goal in the House was to have 45 co-sponsors by the end of this year. Well, we're at 54. Our goal is to have it introduced in the Senate though, and we haven't got there yet. We're still working on that. And so this is a way for us to be accountable to ourselves and to our larger, to all of you by saying, you know, this is the agenda and this is how we get there. And if we're, you know, not there yet on some things, then that gives us a good starting point for a conversation on what's going wrong and what, you know, what needs to be adjusted. This is also a living document that we update we look at every year, we update every 2 to 3 years as needed. And so it represents how seriously we take ourselves and all of you that we put it together. George, is there anything you want to add about that?
Not anything to add about how we're going to get there so much. I want us to get to questions and answers. And there's one other thing I meant to say that I want to say before we hang up. That's it.
Okay, well, let me just hop through this and then you can add in and then we'll get to the Q&A. So these are our programs and campaigns. I'm not going to go into them in great detail. We actually do webinars on each one of these things if you want to participate in them and let people know how to do that. Pledge to Amend is a campaign to target people running for office to take the pledge. If they want to serve the public, then they need to have a position on this, whether they're running for local, state, or federal office. We the People Lobby, we train folks on how to do citizen lobbying, and that's how we've gotten so many co-sponsors. We started with a group of volunteers who really had almost no lobbying experience, and we've come a long way. We're going to have a lobby day next month as part of our leadership summit in DC in June. We have a really robust internship program where we train generally young people on how to run an organization and be part of social change and movement building. We're exploring the tactic of direct action because every successful social movement has employed that tactic. And so what is the best way that for us to do that and make sense when our target is the system, not any one corporation? So that makes it a little bit trickier, but we're working on that. We do grassroots organizing, training, and support. Like I said, a lot of our volunteers have never done activism before, and even folks who have, there's always more to learn, right? And so we're trying to organize this whole nation, which is really a continent, and we do trainings on the ground in person and online, and over the phone. We offer support for our volunteers. We do a conference every 2 years, which we've done one so far. The next one is this year in Washington, D.C., and there's still spots available if folks want to join us there. Our movement education program is an internal education for our leadership, for our local leadership, to learn the skills needed to grow a diverse movement, to build organizations that actually can successfully have people from all different backgrounds and experiences, and a consciousness around privilege and oppression and how that plays out and interferes with our ability to work together, and also looks at movement history and movements that have been successful and those that haven't been as successful and why for both of those things and lessons we can learn from that. Our barnstorming tours are when we travel the country doing speaking events and trainings and talks, and resolutions to amend, we've already mentioned, is when we pass resolutions in cities and towns and states calling for the amendment. So this graphic I won't kind of get into, but it sort of shows like how we need to scale up. And the piece that, you know, is missing here that perhaps is an indication of kind of something that we need to be more clear on going forward is the money that needs to go along with the people and the communities and the congressional support to scale up, because we have scaled up in a number of ways and the funds haven't met us on that. So it's not really that we are a bit behind because of, and we've been talking about this in our emails this month, kind of competing pressures and the world falling apart much more in the last few years than it has in an escalated way. And all of that makes things precarious, and it makes it hard for organizations like ours that are working on structural, you know, kind of more long-term solutions. But at the same time, it's more that we have kind of held steady but we actually need to ramp up. And so the funding has held steady, and yet we have, taken on more, as you can see with our list of programs, because that's the work that needs to get done. And so, we need those two things to match. This is kind of a complicated slide that I won't explain in great detail, but it basically shows that the amendment needs to be reintroduced with each new Congress. And so Rick Nolan, for example, is retiring at the end of this year. So we won't have our lead. He originally approached us and said, can I champion your amendment in Congress, before we had it introduced there. And we're working now to identify a new lead. And I'm pleased to say that several congressional offices are basically courting us and asking and trying to get us to pick them. And so that's exciting, and we will have no trouble having it reintroduced next time. We can't really share any details about that yet because it's not public, but we will be able to, I think, soon. And then this is just a little bit of, for transparency, kind of understanding of, our budget right now that we really need to raise. It's $575,000. You can see on the left kind of the breakdown of expenses towards that end. Sorry that there's like a weird something going on with that graphic there. And then on the right is how our projections of how we're hoping to raise that money. And you can see that most of it comes from individuals. And we do get some charitable donations or foundations, but that's mostly family foundations, and those are also mostly in, relatively small contributions of 10, 15, maybe 20,000. That's the most we've ever received from any one source. This is us. There's a few of us who are not actually on the team anymore, and some new folks who have been added since this picture was taken, but this gives you a sense of kind of who we are. We're, a very diverse national team from all over the country, different ages, different races, ethnicities, backgrounds, class backgrounds, and then all these little bubbles on the map represent all of our local groups all over the country that are also, unique and different, but we don't have photos of everybody. And just a quick stuff about our structure for those of you who don't know, we call them local affiliates. Those are basically like our local chapters. That's where most of the work gets done with Move to Amend, and national supports that local grassroots work. We're building up towards having state chapters. And then our Move to Amend national team is our national leadership team, which is our board of directors, which George serves on. I'm a member of our staff team, and then we have an intern team. So we're a grassroots volunteer-led organization. All of our affiliate folks are volunteers. All of our board members are volunteers. And then we have a small but mighty staff team as well. So where we need to go from here, we're trying to raise $150,000 to make up our shortfall. We also need to increase our monthly donations, because we really see as the future in terms of sustainability. That's where we need to go. Our average donation from folks is $40, even counting our largest donations. And so, most of our supporters are not in a position to write a check for $1,000. Some of you are, but most folks are not. But almost everybody is in a position to give monthly at some level. So I give $28 a month. All of our staff give, monthly. All of our board members give monthly. Many of our interns who are, paid a mealy stipend and are in college give monthly, because that is our investment and our commitment to this work. And so if you're not a monthly donor, I hope you will become one and use this opportunity to do that. And then, and help us make our shortfall. I can tell you that we had a good day today, and for our last, basically 80,000 that we need to raise in terms of where we're at right now, we're working on getting some of our larger donors to pledge half of that together, and then we need to, and with the idea that our grassroots support at the 1,000 or less level would match that. And if we can kind of get both entities and basically do that matching contribution, then that will pull us through. And so that's where we're going to go. And we got 25,000 today from two different donors, or collectively 25,000, 10 and 15 towards that 40 And I have a couple more phone calls later this week and next week to do the rest. And then.
So Caitlin, let's try to get to these questions. Right now, we've got 4 or 5 questions from Mark that I've seen, and I'll take a shot at them, and then you can fill in what I've missed. Mark, I know that in early May, and if you're on our list and get our emails, you may find one from early May that addresses, I think, almost every question you've asked here in more detail than I will, and maybe that Caitlin may not have time to fill in about. I do know that indeed, if everyone on our list gave $1, we'd be fine. But everyone who signed the petition doesn't get or open the emails. I think we've got about 200 or so thousand people that regularly get our emails. And a really small number of those open emails regularly. I do know that post the 2016 elections, things changed in terms of people's response to emails. And unlike other groups, we don't have a habit of hitting people up every day and a half saying, "End Citizens United and the world will be great and give us some money." We're not about that. We're not a business. We are truly a nonprofit doing the work. And yes, our affiliate, our supporters, as Caitlin referenced to with the average $40 gift per person, yes, our hardcore, consistent supporters are participating and supporting us, as are the cities where we passed initiatives. But we do need to get that influx of cash, about another 5,000 or 6,000 per day from our grassroots folks, and we need major donors to come through as well. And we need those regular small donations every month, $5 or $10 a month from a good number of people, and we will be fine. Absolutely, people need to get the connection between corporate rule and their day-to-day lives. Sometimes that feels like it's getting closer for people when you look at the news and talk about things, and people can make the connection between, devastations of weather like floods and volcanic eruptions and what's going on with corporations trying to make money out of everything. But yes, there's a lot more political education that can happen. Our base is learning how to do that well as learning how to build relationships across difference, build power, and do basic, effective community organizing. And stay tuned for really good news about getting us some Senate co-sponsors. We're working on it and trust that things will go well.
Yeah, I guess I would add a couple things, and others, if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat or you can click on the Q&A button and you can type your question there. So thanks for your questions, Mark. And I guess I would just add, so yeah, as George said, I mean, and this is not unique to Move to Amend. Like, it's like a 2% is standard, industry standard, in terms of 2% of people open emails, right? So that's part of why us and others, when we're in a campaign, have to send multiple emails in order to, break through the noise. And so one of the things that we're really looking at how we need to adjust is a deeper organizational culture around the monthly giving and how important that is, and how, that way it doesn't really matter whether you open every email or, kind of get the whole, or whenever we're in person, talking about making that investment for this campaign for the long run. And so that's one thing that I think we need to do better, and we're going to work on for the future. There are, at this point, you said less than 900. At this point, there are about 1,200 people who have contributed this month. A lot of people who have never contributed before. This is another thing. I don't know, apologies if you know these things, but in terms of again, nonprofit kind of standards, a lot of donors, especially for a group like us that's sort of more political, so people are used to oh yeah, click $5, I'll give to this candidate or whatever, and that's a lot of our base is sort of a similar the people who give to political campaigns, and so they're not necessarily used to giving again and again, And so with, we have about an average of about 6,000 to 7,000 people who donate to Move to Amend every year. But those are not the same. Some people have stayed with us all along. And if you're one of those people, any of you, thank you. But people do come and go. And also we've seen that, and part of what we've been talking about in our emails is kind of explaining that a lot of people are saying, I was giving all my money to Bernie Sanders. Then I gave all my money against Trump. Now I'm giving all my money to the ACLU because they're fighting, against immigrant deportations, which is really important, but it sort of is. And for a while there, we were that issue, after Citizens United, we were able to capitalize on the spotlight for a bit. And now that attention has shifted elsewhere, how do we make sure that there's the staying power in terms of folks keeping invested? People are keeping invested with their time. We're still doing the work, but is the money matching that? And so that's part of it. And for the people who don't have the time to donate, are they contributing money? Because like you said, and George said this too, if everybody pitched in, we certainly have a big enough list that we could be a sustainable organization, but can we get everyone to understand that? So that's part of what we need to do better. And also our local folks need to do better. We don't require our affiliates to contribute or pay us and some national organizations do require that of their chapters. We don't. We actually, help provide resources and training and stuff for affiliates to fundraise, because a lot of them need to do that, themselves. But our supporters give as individuals, and almost all of them are monthly donors and are shoring that up this month. That's one of the places where we're going to very first, of if you're putting in 10 hours a week, then you should certainly put in $10 a month. And the states and cities, in terms of official support from states and cities, that isn't something that can be done in official capacity. But again, that's where we have our affiliates and those communities. We have bases of support in those communities. And so those are communities we go back and visit and engage in this process. And I encourage you, if you haven't checked it out, to look at our corporate rule stories on our website, which is, one attempt for us to address part of what you're asking about in terms of the day-to-day issues that affect people's lives, and making this structural issue that we're working on, the connections, because that is a challenge. And, certainly we're open to feedback on how to do it better, and we invite others to submit corporate rule stories. Virginia, who's actually on this call and is one of our supporters and volunteers and former board member and all around person who's been working on this issue for generations, is one of our volunteers on our grassroots movement committee, where we write those stories. And so if you have ideas for topics, you can submit them to us, but also if you want to help us write them, we kind of provide the guidelines for how you could submit your own stories. And a lot of the examples that you give here are good ones that we'll pass on. And then in terms of the U.S. Senate, that's part of the Senate is just a lot more conservative than the House in terms of being willing to take things on that are not going to pass right away. So we've made good inroads, and I'm hopeful that through finding a new lead in the House, one of the things that we're telling folks who want to work with us to become our lead is that, okay, we're going to be choosing who to work with based on how much you're going to be able to help us bring a senator to the table. And so that's part of why I think that we might have some good news on that. Hopefully this Congress, but if not this Congress, then going into the next one for sure. So William asks, have you heard of the new film Dark Money? See darkmoneyfilm.com. Yes, we have. And actually the director I haven't spoken with her, but has been speaking with our outreach director, and we're looking at trying to find ways to work together. So absolutely, she's a supporter of Move to Amend. Does anyone else have any questions? I think we're probably at 6:05, so we can
9:05. Thank you very much.
9:05 for those. Sorry. Touche.
Right.
So happy to take any other questions if folks have them. But again, just a reminder that, we still have a ways to go. We still have, a week and a half or so left in the month. And we're, I think, on our way to meeting our goal. It's pretty typical that there's a big rise and then, kind of going out. And so that's part of why we want to make sure that our larger donors invest as much as our smaller donors have. We had hundreds of new people contribute who had never given before. We have over, it was 128 yesterday, and I know it's more now, new sustainers who have come on this month. So we've had a great response, but there's still a bit more to go. So if you already give monthly, then asking your friends to give monthly. If you already have made a donation to help with the shortfall, thank you very much. And please ask your friends, because we can't really survive if we don't get this amendment passed. And that's how fundamental I think that this is. That's why I'm working on this issue. I have organized my whole life, getting out of college, to be able to work on this issue, because I think that this is, so that's
right.
Years now, the most important and most strategic thing. And if somebody presents me with a more strategic proposal, then that's actually what I'll go work on, because democracy and saving our planet is my agenda. And I see Move to Amend as the means to do that. But if there's a better way, then I'll go find that. But so far, I have not found anything more strategic, more structural, more functional, and fundamental to addressing almost all of the problems that we have in our world. So,
and I want to ask for something very different, but also to support us. And this is something that I'd like you to consider doing every day from now until the end of the month to help Move to Amend get there. It's about energy and energy work. And it's going to be really easy. Every day, I want you to do something that generates joy for you. That might be watching a great film, listening to a piece of music, dancing along with it. For some people, it might be a prayer or a hymn, or reading something special, or hanging out with a baby or an old person. Something that fills your heart with joy. Joy is the key word. If you ever have that feeling like you're about to float or you're lifting off, I want you to do something every day that definitely generates that joy, and I want you to send it right to Move to Amend. As it's happening, as you're reading that prayer. Right now I'm thinking about a Stevie Wonder song called It's Like Always. A friend of mine died recently and it was playing at her wedding. So I think about it a lot with her, and it's a beautiful Stevie Wonder song. If I was listening to that song and thinking about her, and beauty and joy and faith and love and candles and magic, just send that energy to Move to Amend. And it might be silly, it might be something you would never consider serious. Take it on as an experiment for the next 10 days. We'll see how it goes. Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Thank you so much.
So William, I saw your question, and I did just answer it in the chat. We do have folks making calls. Our staff are making calls almost every day. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. We're all
got to pick up the phone.
Calls, but yeah, it is hard to get people to answer the phone too. So we leave a voicemail asking people to check their email. And we're also going to try sending some texts in the last week as well. So that's the thing, is that we live in this world where people are bombarded, and we've put up all these barriers to try and keep anything from coming in that we don't, there's so much noise and so much clutter. And I understand, I do it too, but we've got to be able to break through it. And so maybe doing some of the techniques that George is proposing would help us get there. So we welcome your feedback on this webinar. When we close in the next 30 seconds, you'll be taken to a link where you can give us that feedback. If you have any questions, and Mark, if you would like to talk in more detail about your questions, I'd be happy to do a phone call with you, and that's true for any of you. Feel free. I did see your email now, and I'll shoot you back a message so that you have my own email. And if you'd like to set up a call, we can talk more. So thank you for being here. Thanks, George, for joining me 3 hours later. And we will be doing one more of these next Wednesday on the last day of the month. So if you want to encourage folks to join us, thanks to all of you who are contributors and for your support. Many of you donate your time as well. So thank you for being part of Move to Amend. All right, we're going to go out with George dancing. Have a good night, everyone. And we will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.